I still hear it, even now, months after they pulled me from the wreckage, after the Medicaid teams declared me physically sound, and the ecclesiarchy representatives proclaimed my survival a miracle of the God Emperor's grace. I still hear it, the sound that the reality barrier makes when it begins to fail. It is not a sound that belongs in the material universe, not a frequency that human ears should be capable of perceiving, and yet I heard it, I hear it still. It wakes me in the small hours when the hab block is silent, and the only light comes from the eternal glow of the industrial stacks beyond my window. I hear it in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths, in that liminal moment when consciousness wavers between waking and sleep. The Medicaid officers tell me it will fade. The ecclesiarchy representatives tell me it is a blessing, a reminder of the Emperor's protection. They are wrong. It is neither fading nor blessing. It is a warning, a prophecy, a promise of what waits for every soul that dares to cross the void between stars. I was a junior deck officer aboard the Times Hammer of Faithful Deliverance, a transport vessel of no particular distinction carrying 17,000 souls across the Immaterium, from the Segmentum staging grounds to a frontier world I will not name. We had made the crossing 43 times in the ship's history, 43 successful translations into the Immaterium and back to real space, each one unremarkable, each one completed with the mechanical efficiency that the Imperial Navy demands. I had served aboard for 6 of those crossings, had learned to sleep through the subtle vibration of the reality barrier generators, had grown accustomed to the taste of recycled air and the weight of void duty upon my shoulders. I was 24 standard years old when we began our 44th crossing. I was something else entirely when it ended. The translation itself was unremarkable. Captain Vornis gave the order at 700 hours ship time, and the navigator, a withered figure I had seen perhaps 3 times in my entire service aboard, initiated the breach. I felt the familiar lurch in my stomach, the momentary sensation of falling in all directions simultaneously, and then the hum of the reality barrier settled over the ship like a second skin. That hum was my lullaby, my constant companion during warp transit. It was the sound of safety, of the thin membrane of sanctified technology that kept the howling chaos of the Immaterium from flooding our corridors. Every crew member learned to love that sound, learned to draw comfort from its steady vibration. We slept to it. We worked to it. We prayed to it in our own silent ways, even those of us who kept our devotions private. The hum meant we were alive. The hum meant we would remain so. It was 19 hours into the transit when I first noticed the change. I was on 3rd watch in the observation chamber, a small alcove on the port side of Deck 17 where junior officers monitored secondary systems and dreamed of the promotions that would move us closer to the bridge. The hum had been constant for 19 hours, so constant that I had stopped consciously hearing it, the way one stops hearing the beating of one's own heart. But something made me listen. Something made me pause in my routine inspection of the atmospheric recyclers and tilt my head toward the reinforced viewport that showed only the swirling madness of the Immaterium beyond our hull. The hum was different, not louder, not quieter, but different in a way I could not articulate. There was a frequency within it that I had never noticed before, a subtle undertone that seemed to vibrate not in my ears but somewhere deeper, somewhere behind my thoughts. I logged the observation in my personal notes, marked the timestamp, and thought nothing more of it. I should have reported it immediately. I should have gone to Lieutenant Commander Erasmus and told him what I had heard. But what would I have said? That the hum sounded strange? That I felt uneasy for no reason I could name? Junior officers do not disturb their superiors with feelings. The Imperial Navy runs on discipline, on hierarchy, on the absolute certainty that every person knows their place and performs their function without question. I knew my place. I performed my function, and I told myself that the strange frequency was simply my imagination, a product of too many hours staring at cogitator screens and too few hours of quality sleep. The next shift would bring clarity. Rest would bring perspective. I was wrong. The crew of the Times Hammer of Faithful Deliverance Times numbered 473 souls, in addition to the 17,000 pilgrims and colonists who slumbered in the cryodecks below. Of those 473, I knew perhaps 60 by name, another 100 by face, and the rest only as silhouettes moving through corridors, performing their duties with the same mechanical precision that I performed mine. We were not friends, we were not family, we were components of a machine, interchangeable and expendable, our value measured only by our function. I had made my peace with this reality long before I ever set foot aboard a void ship. It is the way of the Imperium, the price we pay for the privilege of serving the God Emperor, and I accepted it without complaint. But in the hours that followed, as the reality barrier continued its strange mutation, I found myself looking at my fellow crew members with different eyes. I found myself wondering which of them heard it too, which of them lay awake in their bunks listening to that impossible frequency, which of them were already beginning to change. 27 hours into the transit, the navigator sent a message to the bridge. I was not present when it arrived, but word spread through the ship with the speed of rumor, passed from rating to rating in hushed voices and worried glances. The navigator had reported unusual currents in the Immaterium, eddies and flows that did not match any of the standard charts. Captain Vornis had ordered all hands to maintain standard operations and trust in the Emperor's guidance. The message itself was simple, unremarkable, the sort of minor course correction that happened on every warp transit. But there was something else, something that the official message did not contain, but that every crew member seemed to know nonetheless. The navigator had sealed the doors to the navigation spire. The navigator had requested that no one, not even the captain himself, attempt to enter until we returned to real space. When I heard this, I felt the frequency in the reality barrier's hum grow stronger, felt it vibrating in the hollow spaces of my bones, and I knew that something was terribly wrong. I tried to speak with Lieutenant Commander Erasmus about my concerns. I found him in the officers' mess on Deck 8, nursing a cup of recaf that had long since gone cold, staring at nothing with eyes that seemed to look through the bulkhead into some distant place I could not see. When I approached, he startled as if waking from a dream, and for a moment there was something in his face that I had never seen before. Fear, not the controlled, manageable fear that every void sailor learns to master, but something deeper, something primal, the fear of prey that knows the predator is close. It passed in an instant, replaced by the professional mask that every officer learns to wear. But I had seen it. I had seen behind the mask. "What is it, Ensign?" His voice was steady, practiced, the voice of a man who had given orders in the heat of battle and the stillness of routine. "Sir, I wanted to report an observation. The reality barrier generators, I believe there may be a fluctuation in their output, a secondary frequency that I have not encountered before." He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched him decide whether to dismiss me or take me seriously. "You can hear it too," he said finally, and his voice was not the voice of an officer speaking to a subordinate. It was the voice of a man speaking to another human being, equals in their terror. I hoped I was the only one. "Sir, return to your station, Ensign. Perform your duties, and if anyone asks, we did not have this conversation." He picked up his recaf, took a sip of the cold, bitter liquid, and turned away. I understood. I had been dismissed. I had also been confirmed. Whatever I was hearing, whatever impossible frequency was vibrating through the ship's bones, I was not alone in hearing it, and we were both too afraid to speak of it officially. The changes began at 31 hours. I was in my bunk, attempting to sleep, when I heard the first scream. It was distant, muffled by countless layers of metal and insulation, but it was unmistakable, human, terrified, abruptly silenced. I sat up in the darkness of my quarters, listened to the hum of the reality barrier, and felt the frequency stronger than ever before. It was not just an undertone now, it was becoming the dominant note, overwhelming the comfortable vibration I had known, replacing it with something that made my skin crawl and my thoughts scatter like frightened vermin. I dressed quickly, grabbed my sidearm, and went into the corridor. The lights were flickering. Not the emergency flicker of power failure, but something else, a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, almost rhythmic, as if the ship itself was breathing. I made my way toward the source of the scream, following corridors I had walked 1,000 times, and found them changed. The walls were the same grey metal, the same devotional placards and Imperial aquillas, but they seemed different in ways I could not articulate. The angles were wrong. The distances between fixtures had shifted subtly. I told myself it was my imagination, my fear distorting my perception, but I knew the truth even then. The Immaterium was leaking through. The reality barrier was failing. I found the source of the scream on Deck 15, in a maintenance alcove near the secondary power conduits, rating third-class Mira Vance, a young woman I had spoken to perhaps twice in my entire service, her duties being so far removed from mine that our paths rarely crossed. She was sitting against the wall, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around herself, rocking back and forth with a gentle, rhythmic motion. Her eyes were open, but they did not see me. They saw something else, something far away or perhaps terribly close, something that had broken her in a way that no amount of time or therapy would repair. I knelt beside her, spoke her name, touched her shoulder gently. She did not respond. She only rocked and whispered, and the words she whispered were not words I recognized. They were not words in any language I knew. They were sounds that should not have been possible for a human throat to produce. I left her there. Emperor, forgive me. I left her there because I did not know what else to do, because I was afraid, because the frequency in the reality barrier's hum was growing louder, and I could feel it beginning to change me too. I reported the incident via Vox, gave her location to the Medicae staff, and continued my patrol because that was my duty, because the Imperial Navy taught us that duty was the only anchor in the storm, the only certainty in a universe of chaos. Perform your function, trust in your training, let the officers make the decisions. I was a junior deck officer. My function was to observe and report. I observed, I reported, and I pretended that the ship was not dying around me. The next 6 hours brought more screams, more broken crew members, more evidence that the reality barrier was failing in ways that the tech priests could not explain. I saw men I had known, men I had worked beside for years, begin to speak in tongues they did not know, begin to see things that were not there, begin to claw at their own flesh, as if trying to tear something out from beneath the skin. I saw a woman walk calmly into a bulkhead as if it were a door, her face twisted into an expression of beatific peace, her skull splitting against the unyielding metal without so much as a whimper. I saw a work gang in one of the cargo holds standing perfectly still, arranged in a pattern I did not recognize, their mouths moving in unison but producing no sound. The ship was coming apart, not structurally but spiritually, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. At 38 hours, Captain Vornis made an announcement. His voice came through the Vox speakers on every deck, calm and measured, the voice of absolute authority. We were experiencing minor technical difficulties with the reality barrier, he said. The tech priests were working to resolve the issue. All crew were ordered to remain at their stations and continue normal operations. Prayer services would be conducted in the ship's chapel every 4 hours. The Emperor protects. The Emperor provides. Trust in the Emperor's light. I listened to his words, and I heard the frequency behind them, that impossible undertone that had woven itself into every sound aboard the ship. Captain Vornis was lying, not intentionally, perhaps, not consciously, but lying nonetheless. He was telling us what he believed we needed to hear, what might keep us functioning long enough to complete the transit, what might give us the illusion of hope. I understood. In his place, I might have done the same, but I had heard Lieutenant Commander Erasmus admit that he could hear the frequency too. I had seen the look in his eyes, the primal fear that no training could suppress. If the senior officers were afraid, if even they did not know what was happening, then the situation was far worse than any announcement could address. I made my way to the navigation spire. I do not know what I hoped to accomplish. The navigator had sealed the doors, had specifically requested that no one enter, and I was a junior deck officer with no authority to countermand that request. But I needed to understand. I needed to know what was happening to us, what was waiting beyond the failing reality barrier, what manner of doom we were sailing toward. The corridors grew stranger as I approached the spire, the angles more acute, the shadows deeper and more mobile than shadows should be. I passed crew members who did not acknowledge me, who walked with their eyes fixed on nothing, who hummed along with the frequency as if it were a familiar tune from childhood. I passed empty corridors that seemed to stretch into impossible distances. I passed a maintenance closet whose door stood open, revealing not tools and equipment but a darkness that had weight, that had presence, that watched me pass with hungry anticipation. The doors to the navigation spire were sealed, as reported, but they were not undamaged. Something had tried to force them open from the outside. Deep gouges marked the metal, scratches and dents that formed patterns I did not want to examine too closely. The lock mechanism was intact, but barely, held together by prayers and the final remnants of its machine spirit's will. I pressed my hand against the cold metal, felt the vibration of the reality barrier's hum flowing through it, and listened. From beyond the doors came a sound, not the navigator's voice, not the hum of sacred equipment, but something else. Breathing, slow and regular, and far too large to be human. And beneath the breathing, whispered words in a language that predated human civilization, words that carried meaning without comprehension, words that made my soul shiver in its mortal cage. I fled. I am not ashamed to admit it now, though I felt shame then, felt the weight of cowardice pressing down upon me as I ran through corridors that no longer made geometric sense. The ship was changing. The bulkheads were sweating a substance that might have been condensation but was not. The lights were dimming in some sections, brightening in others, creating pools of illumination and shadow that seemed to move when I was not looking directly at them. The crew I passed were fewer now, and those I saw were not the crew I remembered. There were faces I did not recognize, uniforms that fit wrong, insignias that belonged to regiments and vessels that had never served aboard our ship. They walked past me without acknowledgement, performing duties that I could not identify, speaking to one another in voices that I could almost but not quite understand. I found Lieutenant Commander Erasmus in his quarters, the door hanging open, the lights inside flickering in that breathing rhythm. He was sitting at his desk, his service pistol in his hand, his eyes fixed on the far wall where something had written words in what might have been blood, but was too dark, too thick, too alive. I could not read the words. Every time I tried to focus on them, they shifted, rearranged themselves, became something else that was equally incomprehensible. "Sir," I said, and my voice was a whisper, a prayer, a plea. "Sir, what do we do?" He looked at me, and I saw that his eyes had changed. The pupils were too large, the irises bleeding color into the whites, and there was something moving behind them, something that was not entirely him. "The navigator," he said, and his voice was his own, but also not his own, layered with harmonics that should not exist. The navigator saw what was coming, sealed herself in to keep it out, but it was already inside. It was always inside. We carry it with us, Ensign. Every human soul is a doorway. Every mind is a crack in the wall. The reality barrier is failing, yes, has been failing since we entered the Immaterium. Perhaps was never truly intact at all. Do you understand what the barrier does, Ensign? It does not keep the Immaterium out. That is impossible. The Immaterium is everywhere, in everything, the underpinning of reality itself. The barrier simply tells reality what shape to take. It reminds the ship that it is a ship, reminds the crew that they are crew, reminds the laws of physics that they are laws. When the barrier fails, reality forgets. And in the forgetting, other things remember. Other things remember that they were here first, that this universe belongs to them, that we are merely squatters in a house built on their bones. I wanted to respond, wanted to argue, wanted to cling to the rational explanations that the Imperial Navy had taught me, but I could not, because I could hear the frequency more clearly now than ever before, could feel it vibrating in my teeth and my fingernails and the fluid in my eyes, and I knew that Erasmus was telling the truth behind the ecclesiarchy's platitudes, the truth behind the tech priest's rituals, the truth that every void sailor suspects but none dare speak aloud. We were not protected. We had never been protected. We were simply lucky, crossing the Immaterium again and again, each time betting our souls against odds we did not understand, each time surviving only because the things that dwelt in that howling chaos chose not to notice us. This time, they had noticed. What should I do? I asked again, and I was not asking Lieutenant Commander Erasmus anymore. I was asking the universe, the Emperor, anyone or anything that might hear and might care. What can anyone do? Erasmus raised his service pistol, not toward me but toward his own temple, and I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. You can choose, he said. You can choose to end it cleanly, before you become something else. Or you can choose to fight, to struggle, to hold on to yourself for as long as possible. It will not matter in the end. Nothing matters in the end. But the choice is yours, the only freedom any of us truly have. The shot was loud in the small space, louder than it should have been, echoing and re-echoing through corridors that carried sound in ways they should not have. I watched Erasmus die, watched his body slump over his desk, watched the blood pool beneath him in patterns that were not random, that seemed to form symbols and sigils that I did not want to understand. And then I ran again, because that was all I knew how to do, because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant understanding and understanding meant madness. I ran through a ship that was no longer the ship I knew, through corridors that bent and twisted and sometimes opened onto vistas that could not exist, views of impossible geometries and colors that had no names and entities that were vast beyond comprehension, that looked at me as I passed with eyes that were not eyes, with attention that was not attention, with a curiosity that felt like being dissected while still alive. I do not know how long I ran. Time had ceased to have meaning aboard the Time's hammer of faithful deliverance asterisk, had become another victim of the failing reality barrier. Sometimes I ran for hours that felt like seconds. Sometimes I ran for seconds that stretched into eternities. I passed through chambers that I recognized, and chambers that I did not. Encountered crew members who were still human, and crew members who had become something else, saw things that I have tried every day since to forget, and have never been able to. The ship was dying. The ship was transforming. The ship was becoming a wound in reality, a doorway through which the Immaterium could pour into the material universe, and we were all caught in the threshold, trapped between what we had been and what we were becoming. I found the chapel at some point in my wandering. It should have been on deck 6, but it was not on any deck anymore, suspended in a space that had no coordinates, accessible through a door that opened from a corridor that should not have connected to it. Inside, I found survivors, perhaps 50 crew members, huddled together in the nave, their voices raised in prayer. The ecclesiarchy representative who led our spiritual welfare was at the altar, his robes stained with blood and other substances, his voice hoarse from hours of continuous invocation. Above him, the golden aquila that should have adorned the altar had changed. Its wings were still spread, but they were no longer metallic. They were organic, feathered with what might have been feathers but moved like flesh, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the frequency I had been hearing since the beginning. Its eyes, which should have been stylized representations, were open and watching, tracking the movements of everyone in the chapel with predatory interest. I joined the survivors because I had nowhere else to go. I knelt among them, added my voice to their prayers, clung to the familiar words as if they were a lifeline. The Emperor protects. The Emperor provides. Ave Imperator. But the words felt hollow, felt meaningless, felt like sounds without significance in a place where significance itself had been torn apart. I prayed anyway. What else was there to do? The chaplain, Confessor Mordecai. I remembered now. A thin man with kind eyes who had always made time for crew members, struggling with their faith, continued his litany without pause, but I could see that his eyes had changed too. Not in the way Erasmus's had changed, not with that bleeding color and impossible depth, but with something else. A light, a terrible, burning light that seemed to come from somewhere behind his skull, illuminating his face from within, casting shadows that moved independently of the light sources in the chapel. He was still human, I thought. Still himself, but something else was speaking through him, something that wore his faith like a garment, something that was using his devotion as a channel. "The navigator is dead," he said suddenly, interrupting his own prayer, his voice carrying a resonance that filled the chapel without seeming louder. "She opened herself to the Immaterium to guide us, and she drowned in it. She is still there, still falling, still screaming in the space between spaces. She will scream forever. Do you hear her? Listen, listen to the walls. She is trying to warn us." I listened, and I heard it. Beneath the hum of the failing reality barrier, beneath the frequency that had burrowed into my consciousness, there was another sound. A voice, a woman's voice, stretched and distorted across dimensions that human perception was never meant to navigate. She was screaming words, names, coordinates, warnings. But they arrived broken, fragmented, the syllables scattered across moments that no longer followed each other in proper sequence. I caught pieces. Barrier holding at 17%, something in the aft sections. It's killing the crew, and wearing the captain. Don't trust the captain. He made a emergency translation. I can feel the real space coordinates, but they're so far. The captain. The words snagged in my mind, refused to let go. Don't trust the captain. He made a what? A deal? A mistake? A sacrifice? I remembered Vornis's announcement, his calm assurance that everything was under control, his orders to trust in the Emperor's light. I remembered how little we had seen of him since the transit began, how he had remained on the bridge while his crew transformed and died, and lost themselves in corridors that no longer made sense. What did the navigator know? What had she seen before she drowned in the Immaterium? I left the chapel. I had to know. The survivors called after me, begged me to stay, warned me that the corridors were no longer safe. But I was beyond such warnings. Nothing was safe. Nothing had been safe since we entered the Immaterium. Perhaps nothing had been safe since we were born into a universe that cared nothing for human survival. I walked through spaces that hurt to perceive, stepped over bodies that were still breathing but were no longer alive in any meaningful sense, and made my way toward the bridge. The bridge of a Navy transport is typically a cramped, utilitarian space, all function and no form, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The bridge of the time's hammer of faithful deliverance times had been such a place when we began our transit. It was not such a place now. The doors that should have led to it opened instead onto a cathedral, a vast space of soaring arches and stained glass windows that depicted scenes of impossible violence and transcendent suffering. The command consoles were still there, still manned by officers and ratings who worked their stations with mechanical precision. But they were dwarfed by the architecture that had grown around them, by the pillars that rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow, by the altar that had replaced the captain's chair. Captain Vornis stood before the altar, his back to me, his hands raised in a gesture of worship or supplication. He was speaking, but his words were not words, were not sounds that human vocal cords could produce, were frequencies that I felt rather than heard, vibrations that resonated with the hum of the failing reality barrier and the screams of the dead navigator and the pulse of the transformed Aquila in the chapel. He was praying, I realized, praying to something that had heard him, praying to something that had answered. "You came," he said without turning, and his voice was his own again, calm and measured, the voice of absolute authority. "I wondered if any of you would make it this far. Most of them don't. You know, most of them break long before they reach understanding. But you're still yourself, aren't you? Still thinking, still questioning, still clinging to your little shreds of identity. I can respect that. I was the same way, Once. What have you done? I asked, and my voice was steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. The navigator said not to trust you. She said, you made something. A deal? He laughed, and the sound echoed through the cathedral bridge, bouncing off pillars and windows and altars in ways that sound should not bounce. A deal? Is that what she thought? Poor blind creature, seeing so far and understanding so little. I made no deal, Ensign. I simply opened a door. A door that was always there, waiting to be opened. The reality barrier keeps it closed, you see. Keeps us trapped in this little bubble of sanity, this tiny boat on the ocean of chaos. I wanted to see what was on the other side. I wanted to understand. And now I do. Now I understand everything. You killed us, all of us. The crew, the pilgrims, 17,000 souls. I freed them. He turned finally, and I saw his face. And I understood why the navigator had warned me. Why Erasmus had chosen to die rather than continue, why the chaplain's eyes burned with terrible light. Captain Vornis was no longer human, had perhaps not been human for a very long time, since before this transit, since before this ship, since before any of us knew his name. His face was a mask, a shell, a costume worn by something that had no face, no form, no existence in any reality that human minds could comprehend. Behind his eyes was the void. Behind his smile was hunger. Behind his words was a will that had watched civilizations rise and fall and had found them all equally meaningless. The barrier will fail completely within hours, he said, and his voice was almost kind, almost gentle, the voice of a teacher explaining a simple truth to a struggling student. When it does, this ship will cease to exist as a discrete object. It will become part of the Immaterium, and everyone aboard will become part of it too. Their souls will dissolve into the ocean, will become currents and eddies and waves in the endless storm. It is not death, Ensign. Death is an ending. This is a transformation. This is evolution. This is what humanity was always meant to become. I raised my sidearm. I do not know what I hoped to accomplish. The thing wearing Captain Vornis's face was not something that could be killed with a projectile weapon, was not something that obeyed the laws of physics or biology or any science that humanity had ever developed. But I raised the weapon anyway, because it was all I had, because the alternative was to accept what he was telling me, to lie down and let the transformation take me, to become part of the ocean that had no shores. Interesting, Vornis said, and he sounded genuinely amused. You still think you can resist? You still think there is something to resist for? Let me show you something, Ensign. Let me show you the truth. The cathedral bridge dissolved around me. The pillars, the windows, the altar, the officers at their consoles, all of it peeled away like dead skin, revealing what lay beneath. I was standing on nothing, floating in nothing, surrounded by nothing that was somehow everything. The Immaterium, the realm of chaos, the ocean without shores, and I saw what waited there. I saw the things that swam through the endless currents, entities vast beyond comprehension, beings whose smallest thoughts could unmake solar systems. I saw the ghosts of every soul that had ever been lost in warp transit, billions upon billions of them, stretched across eternity, their screams blending together into a symphony of absolute suffering. I saw the future. I saw every ship that would ever translate into the Immaterium, every crew that would ever trust in their reality barriers, every pilgrim and soldier and merchant who would ever bet their soul against the odds. I saw them all fail. I saw them all transform. I saw humanity itself dissolve into the ocean, adding its voice to the eternal chorus of the damned. And then I was back on the bridge, the familiar bridge, the cramped and utilitarian bridge where I had stood 1,000 times before. Captain Vornis was slumped over his command chair, dead for hours or perhaps days, his body already beginning to decompose in ways that corpses should not decompose aboard a temperature-controlled vessel. The officers at their stations were dead too, had been dead since the transit began. their bodies continuing to work their consoles through some lingering muscle memory, or perhaps something worse. The reality barrier was still humming, still flickering, still holding on by threads of failing power and fading faith. And I was alone. I was alone with the frequency that had been with me since the beginning. Alone with the knowledge of what I had seen. Alone with the understanding that nothing I did would matter in the end. But I did something anyway. I moved to the navigator's station, the empty console that linked to the sealed spire, where the drowned seer still screamed her warnings across dimensions. The controls were dead, the machine spirits silent, but I worked them anyway, keyed in sequences I half remembered from emergency training sessions that seemed a lifetime ago. The navigator had found real space coordinates. I had heard her say it, her fragmented voice cutting through the chaos. She had found a way out. She had been trying to initiate an emergency translation before she drowned. The console flickered. The machine spirit stirred. Somewhere in the depths of the ship, ancient systems that had been dormant since we entered the Immaterium began to wake, began to remember what they were designed to do. The frequency in my bones intensified, became almost unbearable, a vibration that threatened to shake me apart at the cellular level. Vornis's corpse began to move, began to twitch, began to reach toward me with fingers that had too many joints. I completed the sequence. I initiated the emergency translation, and reality tore itself apart around me, ripped open like wet paper, revealing the blessed darkness of real space beyond. The ship screamed, metal and bone and spirit all crying out together, as we were ripped from the Immaterium and thrown back into the universe we had left behind. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was Vornis's corpse, dissolving, was the possessed officers crumbling into ash, was the cathedral bridge collapsing back into the cramped utilitarian space it had always been. The last thing I heard was the silence, the blessed, terrible silence of a reality barrier that had finally failed completely, leaving nothing but the thin membrane of real space between myself and the ocean of chaos. They found me 3 days later, a patrol vessel responding to our emergency beacon, our automated distress call that had been broadcasting since we first entered the Immaterium. They found the Times hammer of faithful deliverance Times drifting in deep space, her hull scarred and pitted, her decks silent, her crew reduced to 17 survivors out of 473. The pilgrims in the cryo decks were unharmed, their sleep protecting them from the transformations that had taken the rest of us, their innocence preserved by their unconsciousness. They will never know what happened during our transit. They will never understand why 17,000 of their fellow colonists are still aboard that ship, sleeping the endless sleep, waiting to be awakened on a world we will never reach. The Inquisition came for us, of course, came with their questions and their psychic probes and their instruments designed to detect the taint of chaos. They questioned me for weeks, months, subjected me to tests that I am not permitted to describe, searched every corner of my mind for evidence of corruption. They found nothing. They found no taint, no possession, no lingering connection to the things that dwell in the Immaterium. I was clean, they declared. I was pure. I was a miracle of the Emperor's protection. They are wrong. I still hear the frequency. I hear it now, as I sit in my hab block on a world so far from the void that I will never see the stars again. I hear it when I wake and when I sleep and in every moment between. It is not a sound that belongs in this universe, but it is with me always, a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my consciousness, in ways that no test can detect. The reality barrier held long enough to save my body. It did not hold long enough to save my soul. I know what is coming. I know what happens when the barrier fails, not just on one ship but on every ship. Not just in the Immaterium but in real space itself. The barrier is failing everywhere. The membrane between realities is thinning, weakening, beginning to tear in ways that no tech priest's rituals can repair. Vornis was right about one thing. Humanity was always meant to transform. We were always meant to become part of the ocean. The only question is how long we can resist, how long we can cling to our little shreds of identity. How long we can pretend that we are separate from the chaos that gave us birth. I write this as a warning, a testimony, A confession. I write it knowing that no one will believe me, that the Inquisition will declare it the ravings of a trauma-shattered mind, that it will be filed away in some archive and forgotten for centuries. I write it anyway, because the navigator wrote her warnings too, screamed them across dimensions that she could not cross, tried to save us even as she drowned. I write it because it is all I have left, because the frequency is getting louder, because I can feel the transformation beginning, slow but inexorable, changing me into something that will no longer remember being human. If you are reading this, and if you are preparing to cross the void between stars, know what you are truly risking. The reality barrier is not a wall. It is a prayer. It is a hope. It is a wish made by desperate minds against a universe that does not care whether we survive. Sometimes the prayer is answered. Sometimes the hope is justified. Sometimes the wish comes true. But sometimes the barrier fails. And what happens then is beyond horror, beyond madness, beyond any word that human language has ever conceived. I know. I was there. I am still there, in a way. Part of me never left that ship, never escaped the cathedral bridge, never stopped staring into the void behind Captain Vornis's eyes. Part of me is still screaming with the navigator, still dissolving with the crew, still transforming into something that has no name and no form and no end. The hum is getting louder now. Can you hear it? Listen. Listen to the silence between sounds. Listen to the space between thoughts. Listen to the frequency that underlies all of reality. The vibration that reminds the universe what shape it should take. It is failing. It is failing everywhere. And when it fails completely, when the last barrier falls, when the final prayer goes unanswered, you will understand what I understand. You will understand what happens when the reality barrier fails in the Immaterium. You will understand, and then you will forget. And then you will become part of the forgetting, and then there will be nothing left to understand at all. The Emperor protects, they say. I used to believe that. Now I know the truth. The Emperor protects nothing. The Emperor is the last barrier. The Emperor is the final prayer, and even he is failing, fading, dying on his golden throne while the galaxy burns around him. The hum is louder now. So much louder. I think it is time to stop writing. I think it is time to stop resisting. I think it is time to accept what I have become, what I am becoming, what I was always meant to become. Can you hear it? Can you hear the frequency? Listen, listen. The barrier is failing.